Thank you. Hi guys, thank you all for showing up. It's truly great to be here. I hope you all had an amazing week. It's certainly great what we had here. Thanks to the guys from AltConf and all the volunteers, and I'm super excited to be able to speak here. So again, thanks to all the people that make this amazing event possible. My name is Matheus Cardoso, and I come from right about there, which is a fun place to live if you can handle the scorching temperatures. And today I'll talk about open source. And I've talked about open source and open source projects in other events before, but this is the first time that I'll talk about the lessons and advantages that I've come to learn along the way of maintaining open source software. So why am I doing this talk? What is my motivation? What I've noticed is that most big companies, tech giants, heavily invest on open source. They maintain an impressive amount of open source projects, and they encourage their programmers to contribute to open source in general. But when you get to medium-sized or smaller companies, most have no presence at all on the open source community. And small companies can do great things. The fact they're underrepresented in open source is a huge lost opportunity for them, and I'll tell you why. But first, an important disclaimer. I'm not talking about free software. Free software is its own thing, divorced from open source. And some people get these things mixed up. I recommend you guys check it out, but just be aware it's a whole different thing with its own ideas and political agenda. I have three main objectives today. The first one is to hopefully educate you as best as I can on what is open source. The second, I'll try to put forward the advantages that you can expect from promoting an open source culture inside your company. And I'll share some tips and lessons that I've learned along the way of maintaining open source software. But my main objective really is to convince you that open source software is not something that is just good to use. Like, we know open source is good for users. It's customizable, so the user can have the software do what they want, regardless of what the original author intended. The user controls it, so it's not at the hands of just one company making the decisions. And it's free as in free beer, and we all love free stuff. But it's also something that is worth it to make and to maintain. I wasn't going to do the whole raise your hand thing. I thought it's getting kind of old. But as I started preparing the talk, I got increasingly curious about the AltConf crowd, so bear with me. It's just three questions, and I've arranged them in a way that I kind of expect less hands to show up with each one. So just raise your hand if you identify. Have you sent a pull request to an open source project that you use or your company uses? So yeah, that's like 70% of you. Pretty good. Do you maintain an open source project yourself, be it as a side thing or as a part of your work? Yeah, like, cool, that's 40%. And is at least 25% of your time dedicated to developing open source software? Yeah, like 5% of you. Cool, like cool. So I'm an iOS developer at a company called Rocket.Chat, and I'll talk a little bit about it since it's where I learned most of what I'm going to present to you today. And I'll use it as an example in some instances. So just to give you some context, Rocket.Chat is the leading open source team communications platform. And it's a chat application designed for teams, so you can have things like public channels, private groups, direct messages, and just have a rich messaging experience. So something like more popular versions are Slack. And one of the main things about Rocket.Chat is that it is 100% open source. And all of our code is available on GitHub under the MIT license. And for those not familiar with open source licensing, MIT is a very permissive license. So you can use Rocket.Chat in many ways that you can't use similar platforms such as Slack. You can deploy Rocket.Chat as it is, or you can fork our source code and deploy your own version of Rocket.Chat that is suited to the needs of your company or your group. So basically speaking, you can do whatever you want with it. So if you look us up on GitHub, you'll find everything. You'll find the source code for everything that makes up Rocket.Chat. You'll find our server and web client, our clients for desktop, iOS, Android. Those are completely native. So those of you that are iOS developers, it's cool to check that out. And we also have some experimental ones like React Native and a deprecated version of Cordova. So we just put everything that we make there. And all of those receive hundreds of contributions from all around the world, not to mention a huge ecosystem of bots and integrations. So let's get started. This is going to begin with a history lesson, so try not to fall asleep. It begins in 1953, and there's a lot to talk about this time. It's a very special time. Elvis was still driving his truck for a living, knocking on the doors of big record labels trying to find his first job. The US is going through the post-war economic expansion, also known as the golden age of capitalism. And at that time, many industries were either starting or rapidly expanding. So commercial aviation was becoming popular. TV was by then a common household item. And the first commercial computer was released in the US. It was called the UNIVAC one, and it was the first computer that you could actually buy. That's it if you had about $7 million in your bank account. And also some free space in your living room because it came in this nice package to your house, which is actually what at that time they called a mobile computer. It was a computer that you could fit in a truck. But the amazing thing about the UNIVAC one is, and the reason it's relevant for this talk, is that it came bundled with this A2 programming language. And it would come with its source code and an invitation to send improvements back to the company that made the computer, the UNIVAC. So at that time, you literally had to send your pull request by mail. But nonetheless, in a way, all the way back in 1953, the A2 programming language was an early example of collaborative open source software. And you had innumerable examples like this, because open source was really the norm back then. Software was not considered a commodity. It was just something that came with the hardware, like the packaging. And it was mostly developed by universities, which were already institutions that highly valued the sharing of knowledge. But it was also something highly valued by the consumers, because at that time there were little to no standards. So you really had to adapt the code yourself to work with other mainframe machines of the time. There was no patching over the wire. So you really had to come up with your own bug fixes and improvements to apply directly in the source code. And software was just not very versatile back then. So you really had to make modifications for it to work with your use cases. But as the years went on, these three things started becoming less true. Standards like the IBM PC were formed. Better methods of patching were created with things like floppy disks. Software became a whole lot more versatile with features packed by default. And in 1982, there was the whole fight with Steve Jobs and Apple II clones. People were cloning and the hardware and most notably the software and releasing it as their own product. So you can imagine what happened next. And that ended in a bunch of new copyright laws. And software was no longer practically public domain by default. Proprietary software started making a lot more sense to some companies. But even with proprietary becoming more and more convenient, there were still a large group of people that missed these three things. Some still wanted the software to work with less common machines that weren't considered for first-party support. There are always bugs that affect a small number of users and the proprietary company just won't get it fixed. And even if software was versatile, there are always features that the proprietor will consider not aligned with their vision for the product or not on their long-term roadmap. And some people just want it at that time, and the access to the code brings them that power to make the features they want at the time they want, even if it's not aligned with the company's vision. So because of this, in the 90s, there was this big open source comeback, especially with GNU and Linux. Linux providing the basis for a highly extensible operating system, and GNU was a suite of free open source software. But also an explosion of many other open source projects, many of which are still alive today and in active development. more than 20 years later. Some of which shaped the careers of millions of developers and are even today essential for many companies. And the extent with which we rely on open source as iOS developers is increasing every day. So it's no question that this movement is heavily improving the quality of our work. And these are the results not only of highly talented individuals, but also companies that heavily invest into creating open source projects. And why is that? Why is it that companies invest so heavily in open source? I think they do this not only because open source is a heavily pro-consumer model, that meaning there are inherent advantages for the consumer of open source projects, but there are also inherent advantages for the company or individual that is developing the project. So as I'm going to explain, open source software is as advantageous for those who use it as it is advantageous for those who develop it. And it really begins with collaboration. When you put your code in an open platform, your work will be available for a community to grow around it. And they will not only potentially submit code with new features, but also they'll fix bugs and help with documentation. But also one of the big things is localization. So you have people from all around the world using your product, and they're eager to and proud to help you translate your product to their native language. Our community has translated our user interface to more than 50 languages, and something like that would require us to pay a very expensive ongoing contract with a localization team. And we have that for free. And really, the community can behave as an extension of your internal team. So if you're a small or medium-sized company, your company will be able to leverage a much bigger team than you could ever afford. On Rocket.Chat, we've had really from very early on contributions that are now essential parts of our product. Our official Docker image was initially made by a contributor, and it's now received more than 10 million downloads. Our desktop app also started as a contribution, and it's now officially support and available on most desktop platforms. So when you make your software open source, you invite people to work on features or fixes that often end up being very important, and they come earlier than you expect. And even sometimes you get features that weren't considered a priority by your internal team, but are still highly appreciated by your end users, like our custom emojis, which were a very early on contribution. And let's be real, like no product is perfect, be it open source or proprietary. But what really can make the difference is the amount of eyes you have on your code. Meaning that if you make your code open source, it will be available for critique and suggestions by the community at large. On Rocket.Chat, we've had really many instances where someone from outside looked at our code and realized that we could be doing something better, which resulted in improvement points that could have gone unnoticed otherwise. And really the point is that your code is never really left for dead. There's always fresh eyes looking at your code with new insights on how to make it better, which is also a huge plus for security. Some people think that because the code is open, it is somehow less secure, but the reality is really quite the opposite. Actually, open source has a tendency to be more secure than closed source projects. After all, obfuscation is not a reliable security measure. It just gives a false sense of security instead of focusing on the underlying issue and on acting quick, which is what the community does best. When we ended up having a lot of good exposure for our quick acting on security issues, that's an instance where someone built a virus that targeted specifically chat applications, and we patched it before it could become a problem for us. Also, when you make your code open, your product is automatically viewed as something with no hidden agendas. So it's not only more secure for you as a company, but also more secure for your users. Another advantage that I wanted to talk about is the power of open source projects to attract talent. What's been happening lately is that your company's presence on code sharing platforms like GitHub is the first thing that young talent is looking at for when decided to apply to your company or not. They're looking at things like how many repositories do you have, how active are them, and how many contributors are they getting. Because really they want to know this because they want to figure out how much of their time they'll be able to dedicate to open source while working for your company. Plus, they get to know exactly what technologies your company is working with, and that already offloads some work from the interview process. So when your company has a presence on the open source community, you are much more attractive to young talent. And on the same subject of attracting talent, another advantage that we have as maintainers of open source projects are the many stipends that are available for young students. The biggest example being Google Summer of Code. And what they do is they connect companies with students from all around the world. And they pay these students to work on an open source project for that company for a period of 3 months. And all you need to participate is just to have an open source project. And many companies participate in this program. It's really a huge thing in the open source community. This year, Swift is participating. So this year, they have some students being paid by Google to work on the Swift language and related projects. It's our second year participating at Rocket.Chat, and this year we got 8 slots, which means Google is paying 8 students to work for 3 months for us on various projects. I'm one of the mentors this year for Google Summer of Code, and the project we're doing is to make Rocket.Chat on iOS themable. So you as a user will be able to specify the colors you want the app to have. And also the server will be able to provide themes to match their brand and things like that. And it's a feature that is very requested, but would not be able to fit on our roadmap without this extra member, thanks to Google. So basically, Google Summer of Code is a period where a lot of things get done on open source projects. I also brought this example from GIMP, and it's called endpoint deformation. It's one of the biggest advertised features of their latest release. It was made by a Google Summer of Code student. So it's pretty cool. You have many talented individuals out there. And you participate in you're the sole responsible for selecting these students. So you can really get very good people to work for you for free. And there are many projects and companies taking advantage of these programs and all the other advantages of being open source. There's this book I recommend reading, How Google Works. And it certainly tells the story better than I could tell you. And it's one of the chapters is called Default to Open, Not Closed. And it gives a great example of companies that have thrived on open source business practices. And what I think it does really well is it debunks this old-fashioned idea that if you have a company with an intellectual property, you should build this fortress around everything, and it somehow automatically gives you a competitive advantage. And actually what happens is that products built as open platforms are the ones that scale the most. Really recommend reading that. But of course, you'll find that the advantages don't come without responsibilities. There's a lot of work that goes into making a project open source. It's not just uploading the source code somewhere and expecting people to come. And I'll begin with the most simple, and it's being nice. You can expect people to stick around and contribute to your project if they don't feel safe to express themselves and in issues and pull requests. There are a few keys to achieving this. The first is to just try and be flattered whenever someone submits an issue or a pull request. Even if it's not to your personal liking, they're still showing interest and appreciating something that you made. Not being defensive and being open to criticism is also one of them. Don't be defensive if someone has a different opinion from you. If someone points out something they think you're doing wrong, don't be dismissive. Try to see their side and work it out with them in the most respectful way you can. Because really, the users are your clients, even if they are not paying anything. Your interaction with them is the main driver of your community. So if you delight your users with good support, you're bound to grow a healthy community. And one of the things I'm most proud of at Rocket.Chat, which I think is responsible for our large amount of contributions, is that we allow the contributors maximum possible impact. We go beyond the standard procedures to get a PR by a contributor merged. If he can't meet our standards, we step in and build on top of his PR, and then we merge it. So he still feels like he contributed. So they still feel a sense of accomplishment and are more likely to contribute later. But also don't be afraid to put your foot down. Ultimately, you are responsible for the quality of your project. You should act as the benevolent dictator of your project. And of course, documentation. There's a saying that your code is only as good as your documentation. And that's especially true of open source. You're putting something out there for people to use. And if you don't have documentation for things like APIs, you'll lose like 99% of your potential audience. Work in your README file. It's your homepage, even if you don't have a homepage. Even if you have a homepage, it's the first thing that people will find when they look for you. Look at the most popular repositories. Look at the trending. See what they're doing in terms of automation, continuous integration. See what they're doing to make the lives of contributors easier. And if you do these things, you can end up with a big community, heavily invested into making your project grow. If you do things really right, you can end up achieving what we call a positive feedback loop, where people use your application to make your application better. And things just go uphill from there. We experienced this to an extreme where people started using our chat application to collaborate on improving the chat application. And I think these are one of the most important lessons that I have learned so far. But there are also many other, especially more technical ones that I didn't cover. And I recommend this talk by Felix Cross, the guy that created Fastlane, and it's scaling open source communities. He goes in depth on the more technical side of putting things up, an open source project, and making it grow. I recommend you check that out once you decide to publish some piece of code. And you can start small on that. You don't need to make your flagship product open. That's very unrealistic for most companies, but you can start with things like start just by having a presence. I think if your company doesn't already have organizations in code sharing platforms like GitHub, you should. Make your documentation open source. So if you have something like an API, your users will be able to fill in the gaps and improve it when necessary. And if, for example, one of your programmers came up with some clever piece of code that can be separated into an open source library, I think that should not only be accepted, but also heavily encouraged. Most big companies adopt these practices as an effective way to attract talent and as a talent scouting strategy, but also as a key motivator for their programmers. And you never really know what can come out of it. Like Rocket.Chat started as a side project from a contract company. And when it was made open source, it took off in a big way, and it's now a company of its own. There's this documentary I highly recommend you watch. It's called The Code. It's about GNU and Linux, but it really paints an accurate picture of how the current open source movement got started, and the companies that were formed and were highly successful with open source as part of their business model. So this was the message that I wanted to bring to you guys. If you run a company, try making open source a bigger part of it. You're not going to regret it. Questions?
Hi, thank you for your talk, it was very good. My question was, you mentioned a lot of good benefits of open source projects. So why isn't everyone doing it? What do you think stops companies doing it?
Well, what I think stops doing it is there's two parts to that. There's that, as I said, the old-fashioned idea that if you keep your code closed, somehow it gives you a competitive advantage. If you make your code open, someone will instantly steal it and create a company based off of it that is better than yours, and that's just not true. You're the one that created the code, and you're the one that is more qualified to work on that code. So what you're doing is not empowering other companies to copy your code. You're empowering your users to make your product fit with their necessities, so they're more likely to use your code. And the other part is that it's some work to make your code open source. You have to give your programmers some time. And there are a few companies that are very progressive about this. Heard about, I don't want to mispronounce the name of the company, so I'm just going to say it. But they're a big company that like gives a day a week for employees to work on open source projects. And I think it's pretty cool.
Do you think there's any scenario where open source is not a good idea?
Open source is not a good idea. Really, when you have some code that is your edge, like an algorithm, a sorting algorithm, a search algorithm that only your company has, like that, which is what maybe that specific code is what gives you the competitive advantage, but that doesn't really prevent you from having an open source culture inside your company. So you can make other things open source, you can empower your developers to work on open source projects and things like that.
Cool, thank you.
All right.
I have an interesting question of how to sell that open source idea to management, because of course if management likes that open source idea, it will be pushed down to development, but how to do it from development to management?
I'm not sure if I understood the question. How does the developer convince the manager to?
Yeah, because still there are some features that business requires, and management's saying that you need to build that, and not always there is a time for extra work, and to taking out some pieces, for example, of code that could be open sourced and then maintain it. It's extra work, and you need to convince management that we need that and that it brings value, not just takes out our time.
Yeah, that's tough. I've seen some companies that if you had to make something open source, you had to go through the legal team and everything. And that's really something that we need to work on. It's not something I have the answer to, how to make the best case for making your library open source inside your company. It's really a bunch of arguments that you can make there. And just increase this culture. I think the problem is that the manager just doesn't have the culture. He doesn't know about these advantages that you can make. Yeah, I'm not sure about something specific, but there's, as I said, that book from Google, that book chapter called Default to Open, Not Closed. I think that they make a lot of good points about this. So if you're going through this specifically, I think it's a good read, but it's really just more about culture.
So I suppose my question is kind of along similar lines. I work for a very big company, and our team is getting ready to release some. We're considering releasing some software as open source that we developed, and just wanted to know, before you click that public button on GitHub on the repo, were there any specific steps you have to take to kind of make your lawyers happy or anything like that?
To make your employers happy.
To make the lawyers happy. There's any specific
make
steps
your lawyers happy.
Yeah,
yeah. The first thing is you have to decide on a license. Permissive licenses are very popular right now, so you just put your code there and people can just use it. Because really, it's quite amazing when you have a piece of open source code out there and you're a big company, but every other big company is using it. So you're part of everything. They depend on you. They don't want to do bad. But really, about the first steps, having a license. Some licenses require modifications to the source code to be also open sourced, and some companies don't like that. I think after that, you have to really care about documentation and like working on your README file. But you have to set up a structure to support that open source project. As I said, it's not zero work.
You can't just publish the repo and then forget about it.
Yeah, you can't just publish the repo and forget about it, or it's just going to be there and no one's going to use it.
All right, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for the talk. It was good. Do you have any idea, just because this is here next to WWDC, I know that Rocket.Chat is like major portions of it are written in JavaScript. Do you have a feel for like how large the sort of, at least for your project, obviously, the sort of size of the contributions for things that are being done in JavaScript as opposed to things that would be native Mac or iOS development in Objective-C or Swift?
Oh, I'm very happy with our contributions on iOS. It's very big. Like, I'd say 30 to 40% of our code is contributions, and it's not in any way smaller than our main application, like web application and backend, because really you need the native iOS version to support the things you want. So people end up working on everything together to support every feature across the platforms. So yeah, it's kind of specific, but if the native version is also a big part of it, people will come. Like iOS is really big on open source right now. Many people are contributing.
Great talk, by the way. So my question is more along the side of, for those who hear of the open source buzzword and want to be able to contribute but have no idea where to start, like what would you say is the easiest on-ramp into becoming a contributor where you can feel comfortable, because it could be somewhat I don't know, kind of like a big thing, like, oh my God, what are they going to say about my code? Is it good enough? Is it not good enough? So how do you propose one go into contributing, and how they pick something that gives them an easy on-ramp into contributing to open source?
Great question. So yeah, I had the talk that was more company-centered, so to convince people, but that's also a great point to make. I also started just as a contributor. And what I can tell you is that the easiest way, so you can kind of, I want to contribute to open source, then you look for open source things to contribute to, but really the easiest way would be to use that thing you want to contribute to. So like you have a Vapor, let's say, you want to make a backend in Vapor. So if you use it, it's going to be much easier to see the points where you can improve it and submit the code. And if that repository, if the people that maintain the open source project you want to contribute to are good people, no one's going to judge your code. No one's going to, this is terrible, man, you should go, you should go away. They're not going to close your pull request. It just generally doesn't happen. Like, it does happen, but very, very few. And they're generally going to critique your code in the sense that they'll tell you where you can make it better, and at some point it will be merged and you create more confidence to work on more things. So yeah, start by using an open source library in your project and see where you can make it better.
Hey, Matheus, thank you for the talk. One question is, like, Rocket.Chat is a full-time open source company, right?
Yes.
So you guys, you have your backlog for the features that you want to add, the bugs that you need to solve. And at the same time, you have pull requests coming or user requests. How do you guys manage this time? Like, you have a team that look only for your backlog, and other part of team looking for pull requests and this kind of things.
So yeah, how do we manage having our internal backlog against what the community is currently pushing?
Exactly.
Our thing. So yeah, it really depends. If it's a great quality pull request and it's like custom emojis are not going to be on our backlog because it's not essential, but someone published this code for us, and we think it's well done and things like that. We're going to merge it, like for the next version. It takes some time to review everything. So like we do have a huge backlog of pull requests that is just inhumanly impossible to get to everything, but it's really about what the community wants the most, and also some part of what the company wants.
Okay, thank you.
All right, last call for questions. All right, cool, thank you very much. Oh, one more.
You made a point about being nice to contributors when they show up. What do you find is a good way to attract them? Like, I have a ton of open source projects sitting on GitHub. iStumbler Labs, check it out. But no one ever comes by to make patch requests, right? And some of it I feel like is genuinely useful, right? I have a kit bridge for doing UI kit and app kit crossover apps, for instance. So how do you get people to sort of in the door? It seems like it's a whole other marketing problem alongside marketing your apps.
So yeah, there's two sides to that. There's the luck side. If people are looking for that thing at that time, if it's a trendy library, you're most likely to do almost nothing, and people are going to start it and start using it, and then you feel compelled into making your documentation for it better.
Industry right now, I've got a repo sitting there, and it just sits there. Like I feel like it should be getting attention, but it's not. And I can tweet about it all day long, and no one comes by. Like, is there places to go? Are there forums for this? I mean, do I just come to conferences and talk about it out loud? Like,
well, there are some platforms like Product Hunt and everything. But really, the main platform is GitHub. And people are gonna, if you like, get 15 people to start it, and it's probably gonna maybe show, depending on the language, it's gonna show up on the trending, and then more people are gonna start it. It's kind of like having a YouTube channel. So it can be extremely hard if you're not making something that is trendy, or maybe it's only useful for big companies. But and sometimes even if you put in the work, it's not going to happen. So there's a lot of luck involved. Yeah, it's bad. But like, can you give me an example of what you're doing right now?
So the one in particular is a framework called Kit Bridge that lets you write views, controllers, and delegates that will work on iOS, macOS, tvOS, all from the same source code. So,
that's great. That's something. That's really cool.
Exactly.
Say the name again.
So it's Kit Bridge.
Kit Bridge.
Yeah,
I'll look it up
on the GitHub, please.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. But the problem is that not a lot of people are making macOS code, macOS apps. They're looking for Electron and things like that. And
if you have an iOS code base, we can make moving it over to the Mac much easier. Was the idea, right? I mean, for me, it was I have apps that I wanted to work across platform, and I didn't want to have to write them 3 times. Mm-hmm. So it was. I mean, I do these things kind of for my own benefit and put them out there. It doesn't bother me a lot that no one comes by. It's just I'm curious what it takes. And I've been doing this for 15 years, right? Like iStumbler was open source for a decade, right? And it was kind of the same issue. Like there was, nobody came by, no one would come by. I mean, at the beginning there were 2 Mac developers, so it wasn't a big, it wasn't surprising. And I guess there's still 2 of us and then like 2 million iOS developers, but it's. Yeah, just the promotional side of it has sort of escaped me for a decade and a half. So I'm curious to know if people have had success.
Well, I'll come by. It's really something I'm very interested in. Like, iOS and macOS apps, same code base. But yeah, with the new Marzipan thing coming, I don't know. Yeah.
All right, cool. Seems like that's it then. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. Cool. Interesting time.